Welcome to the DevReady Podcast, where we're helping non-techs build great tech. Today, fortunate enough to be joined to someone a little bit different, Dannielle Pearson, who really has quite a background in history that I'll let her talk about in terms of her experience, but is now thought leadership in critical thinking, been around startups quite a bit in terms of learning around investment, what works, what doesn't, how you might strategize around that. And strategy is a big part of what she does, background in Deloitte, etc. But I'd love to talk about the holistic view of Dannielle in terms of how you got to where you are today and where it all began. Dannielle, thank you for joining us, coming on, just having a quite bit of chat around what might serve the community in terms of when they're thinking about starting a product, what could they think about? And critical thinking will come into this for sure, but love to know about a bit about your background. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Andrew. Thanks very much. Appreciate it. A little bit about me. So it's hard to believe for me that I have a 20-year career span at this point in time, but I guess I do.
It's time flies, doesn't it?
It really does, in a very scary way.
Yeah, it does. I know.
So I am a dual citizen. I'm American and Australian at this point in time. And I actually started my career at a university. I was a military intelligence officer. So I was an Air Force intelligence officer and spent about 10 years in total in the US intelligence community. And I often start with that mainly because I'm a firm believer in what we start in and what we kind of do in our 20s does actually build the strong foundation of who we become. There's a lot of things that happen during that time period. And the Intel community definitely instilled me with a lot of kind of core skill sets in accountability and situational awareness. And you talked about critical thinking, the basis of looking at things very differently and understanding that if you've got a problem set here, there's probably a whole host of things you cannot see that are actually impacting that. And so that was a really foundational piece for me.
It would mold you significantly being around that environment, I would imagine. Just being a part of that for a 10-year period, because you're really living in that environment. It's not just a job, it's all consuming, I would imagine.
Yes, but what's funny is when you're closest to something, you often don't realize it, right? Your feet in the fire, you don't really realize how much it hurts until you back out of it. And probably a bad explanation for that. But it was something that I didn't really realize until I started the second half of my career, which now I'm kind of getting into the third part of my career. And probably 5, 6, 7 years into it, which I'll talk about in a second, that I began to realize, wait a minute, the skills that I learned at that juncture were very different than what I'm developing here. And that was actually a really critical foundational point for me. But more interestingly, I moved to Australia back in 2011. I actually came over via Deloitte, so I'd been with Deloitte in the US. Okay. And then I started my tech time. So I entered into Salesforce. I was at Salesforce for about 5 years. That taught me a lot. I actually have an MBA, but I always say I learned more about how companies operate when I was doing sales at Salesforce. I learned all about how companies make decisions and how they plan for things. And then around 3-4 years into that time period, Salesforce was verticalizing as their core kind of growth strategy. And I got pulled into strategy at that point in time. And what I was doing was really helping Salesforce identify and realize how you would set up a vertical for a particular industry. And so that was everything from what's the opportunity size, how is the industry broken down, what is the product market fit across the associated subsegments of the industry, what is the investment required, the hiring profile, everything from inception to execution. I ran the entire thing for about 1.5 years and really handed over a report to Salesforce with a series of roadmaps of here's what you need to do to effectively set this up. And at that point in time, I got pulled into a business called Procore. And Procore is a construction management software company that was pre-IPO at the time. And that was my first entrance into a pre-IPO, definitely not a startup environment, but very chaotic.
Beyond startup, yes.
Beyond startup, beyond startup. Yeah. And for the listeners, anyone who doesn't know the Procore story, it's actually super interesting. The CEO, Tui Cormatcher, I always forget his last name, so apologies. The CEO was on $1 a year for about 12 to 15 years. So one of the growing jokes is they've got Procore's headquartered in Santa Barbara, and they would literally find talent at Starbucks. So they'd go in and the barista would be really friendly to him, and they're like, oh, do you want a job at Procore? It was the only time that you could enter into the tech industry being a barista. Wow. But really interesting story of he kept through it, he focused on it. So the $1 a year paychecks, I mean, by the time he IPO'd, I think that was a $34 billion valuation. So there's something to being stubborn and sticking to your idea.
Brilliant. How do you live? Is the question I would have.
Well, he was a Silicon
Yeah.
Valley veteran. He had a bit of money
Yeah.
to start
That
with.
helps. Yes.
It does, yeah. But when I was there, really ran strategy across APAC. So I looked at, how did we prioritize markets to get into across ASEAN? How did we look at the ANZ market? Because US headquartered businesses tend not to look at the Australian market and other markets the way that they need to. There's adjustments on what they expect from a revenue forecasting perspective, a product market fit perspective, and a series of other factors that go into how you enter a market. And so I effectively ran and acted as the eyes and ears of the local VP to making sure that we were making the right investments and entering the right markets at the right sequencing and time.
One hell of a job.
It was a fun job.
Well, let's unpack that a little bit. There's been a number of things he's thrown at me. So there's a huge background here. We're not even through it all. In terms of strategy, unpacking strategy for us for a little bit. So when we're looking at any business, it's all about execution. That's the reality. Everyone's got the same idea. When you're in a market, you've got an idea, great. The guy next door's probably got the same idea, and how you execute on it may be the difference. It's going to be the difference. That's the reality. What's some of the things that it taught you coming out of US military space, jumping into Deloitte? I'd imagine there's some critical components you've taken through you to help build and plan out and prioritize strategy and unpacking. Is it data led? How do you approach strategy? What does it look like for you?
Yeah, great question. So it's establishing an informed baseline, and that I find is commonly data led. Anything I've done in the strategic landscape, whether it's working with a founder coming out of an accelerator program all the way through to a multinational, it is what is the baseline and what is the data set? And particularly when you're looking at what the market opportunity is and a product market fit, it's all about data from macroeconomic indicators of how dynamic industry dynamics impact and put pressure on a company or an organization, all the way through to the micro dynamics, which that could be how your customers interacting with you and what kind of behavioral patterns emerge from that, how your organization is structured, whether you're 2 people or you're 10,000 people. And how do you service the customer and how do you develop and grow? There's behavioral patterns in all of that data that is actually indicating what is your start point and where do you go from point 0 to point, horizon 1, horizon 2, horizon 3.
You've probably just got 90% of our listeners shaking a little bit, because most people jump into something with a concept and they start building. So let's talk about this, because the reality is that's where most people begin. They might be in a space, in an industry, they might be around a problem that they've seen, and then they're going after, I've got this concept, let's go after it. And then their first train of thought is, if they're in startup land and or in business, there's a bit of variety who listens to the podcast. If they're in business, they might be looking how we productize something. Generally, they've got a bit more data, a bit more consumer insights. In the world of startup, I find that people jump in 2 feet and then figure it out on the way through. But sometimes we don't have enough runway time to be able to do that. Where do you think people should begin? Yes, we have a concept. Yes, we have a problem. Is it market research as much as we can? How do we manage market research against the agility of testing? What does that look like in that space?
So counterintuitively, I'm against lots of market
Yeah.
research up front. I think you do need to
Okay.
just jump in. You've got an idea, you need to jump in. And I'll actually give an example.
Yeah, go for it.
I won't provide any company names, but there was a startup that I worked with from a sweat equity perspective. And what was interesting about this is they had accidentally built a product that was very similar to a rostering tool. And there were various components of this rostering tool. But someone from an industry within hoteling looked at it and said, you can solve a multi-million-dollar problem with this rostering tool. And what the problem effectively was, or is the hoteling industry, the maid staff, which they refer to as Betties. A lot of those people are contractors, and
Okay.
they are working on hotels. So cleaning up hotel rooms, they do on a hand roster. So there is no digital means to manage that process. And that is universally, globally, within hotel systems. That's why if you've ever been at a
Paper
hotel,
and pen.
paper
Yeah,
and
wow.
pen. And if you've ever been to a hotel and you've had a maid kind of standing outside your door with the cart, that's because she or he has to clean that room. They don't have insight in when you're leaving, but they've got a list of rooms to get through that they're commissioned to get done, they're contracted to get done. And it's a huge problem. Hotels lose millions and millions and millions of dollars a year. So in this instance, there's not a level of market research you could have done to determine, in fact, this problem is largely unknown unless you're in the industry, that you
Of
could have done to
course.
determine that your rostering tool is going to fit that. You're only going to know that by just getting out there. I built something cool. Now I've got to go test it in market, right?
Let's go back a little bit. How did they get to the rostering tool in the first place? Was there a specific angle? What were they thinking in the beginning?
So I would love to unpack that. So this is where my strategy brain and the techos don't always meet eye to eye or work well together. I think it was just very smart techie people playing around with ideas and thought, what can we create? And the guy who ultimately built it had a startup or a technology or an application, I should say. He had a mobile application that he had built and sold. So he had a little bit of money, a little bit of time. And I find particularly those that build product tend to be creative. So they like to kind of play around with things. And it basically just happened where he played around with something and then by a series of coincidences ran into an industry expert in hoteling. And the hoteler said, well, hang on, you've got something here.
It's fascinating. Product first rather than any insight into any industry, which is hiding to nothing in most cases, but continue.
But where I see people go wrong, and I always say there's a spectrum on this, and I've seen this in my days, and part of my background is angel investment with an organization called StartMate, which is, if people aren't familiar with StartMate, they're
That's
affiliated
one of the
with
reasons why we connected. I did see you're
Yeah.
involved in StartMate, so it's definitely an area that intrigues me as to why, how, what you're around.
Yeah. But you'll see kind of three. I hate to bucket people into three groupings, but we'll do it for this. And if you think of a continuum, you see kind of three groupings, right? You see one to the far left, which is kind of the I want to be a founder. I want to be in the startup business because it's sexy and it's cool, and I've got this idea and I'm going to go out with it. Then you've got on the other, let's say the right side of the continuum of these people that are very dogmatic, have drank their Kool-Aid, they're very emotionally and passionate in what they've done, and they're kind of sitting on this side. And then you've got the people in the middle. And the people in the middle of the continuum are kind of what I'm asking your listeners to be more like. And what I mean by that is these are people that have a great idea. They might have even started with product first, but as they get into product first, they allow themselves to be adaptable. So that's where they'll start going, oh, interesting. I've got this product, this hotel director is saying that this would be a good fit. Maybe I should start looking into the hoteling industry. And I do a bit of market research, but then I also do customer interviews and I go talk to organizations and industry groups. And I start getting a real-time view of the market, not just desktop research, but actually go out there and start talking to people because you need those two things working together. And I'm going to evolve.
Conversations spark all sorts of concepts or ideas, thoughts that you'd never get off a desktop. You can't get that research online, effectively.
No, you can't. And I'll go back to that in a second. There are things where online research makes sense, but you're spot on. You just don't. Now, what I've seen in that arena, that kind of middle ground, is those people adapt their offering. So what your offering and product is on day dot versus 3 months versus 6 months, 12 months, 24 months should be constantly evolving. You should be agile. What you get from the left and right, I find, and this is where you've got 90% of startups fail, is either you didn't have enough emotional investment in what you were trying to solve, and therefore you just kind of fall flat, where the interest was more, I want to do a startup and be acquired and it kind of isn't this great. Or on the opposite
The
side,
realization comes after 6 to 12 months that, well, this isn't quite sexy as I thought it was. Yes.
it's a lot of work.
Yeah.
Or you're on this other side of the spectrum where you've kind of, and forgive the term, you've drank a little bit of your own Kool-Aid. You're not backing off from the fact that while you've created something cool and you're emotionally invested in it, right now there's not a market for it, or there's not a buyer, or you need to adapt and adjust. And sometimes I find that these are the most passionate people, and they're the ones that will stick around until the very last dollar. but they have kind of a problem in adapting their technology and therefore kind of fall flat because there's no effective market for it.
So they're continuously just sticking to the same beat of their own drum. And this is the concept, this is the product, and this is who we're going after, and not willing to evolve with it. You have to evolve. The reality is, I've been in business since I was 22, which is close to 18 years now, which has evolved. But the business has changed continuously. Every business will change, and then every product will change, every offering will change. We sell to different people than we used to sell to 15, 20 years ago. That's the reality. And I think that's what startups need to understand is, and I 100% agree, you might build a product first, but that product may be better in a different market, or may be better if you did this, this, and this, and then that market opens up. And you don't know that until you have conversations. The other problem I find in the world of startup is maybe it's that on one, doesn't matter where they are, they don't like to communicate their ideas. They think that I need to build these behind a closed curtain, and then I'll come out in 2 years' time when the product's perfect. And perfect to who? Perfect for you, perfect based on what? That is another area. I don't know where they would sit, but they probably sit on more that dogmatic side because they're really honed in on the concept. Yes, this is it. This is what's going to make a big impact to industry. I'm going to be able to sell this. And they come out and they say, I've got a product. How do I market it? Who do I sell it to? That's the scary part in some instances. Like, what are we really trying to achieve? Is it to serve our ego, or is it to create an impact? What is it? It's quite fascinating, the psychology behind the world of startup as well.
Yeah. Sorry, so many, as you were speaking, so many instances kind of popped into my head of going, I've seen that, I've seen that, I've seen that. The other thing is, if you do develop a product behind closed doors, and let's say you do take 24 months, the market shifted at that point in time. So whatever you were doing 24 months ago, it's not relevant anymore,
Which is scary. And it is shifting that quickly. And it's how do we maintain and stay on course when the market's shifting that fast? It's quite a difficult one in the world of startup right now, in my mind, to just, you must be in tune with your market every day. Reality is, and what's happening in the market, where it's sort of going, what it's pivoting to, what your customers are buying, what are they using, what you thought your customers were today might not be your customers tomorrow. It's an ever evolving thing, but that's business. That's just every facet of business. It's all changing, and changing quicker than it ever did, which makes the opportunity bigger than it ever was too. Because if you can actually find the right market, it's quite a quick growth. And you're seeing these massive growth companies that go from zero to 20 million, $30 million revenue in 6 months. And that's fascinating. We've never been able to achieve that, which is where the sexy exciting comes in, and they get drawn into that. So they're very interesting in terms of the way you've structured them out in those three.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I wanted to say on the market analysis side, I'm going to give 2 points here because I wanted to go back to, hey, sometimes it does have value. One of the mistakes, I guess, I often see, particularly when founders go for funding. And I've sat in on a lot of angel investment syndicates. I've seen how organizations position themselves. I also see when the funding does not come through, which the odds are it's not going to, right? You've got, a very small percentage that you're going to actually get seed funding. But one of the things that people tend to make a mistake about, and you talk about psychology, is I've reviewed hundreds of pitch decks. 95% of them have that obligatory total addressable TAM market slide. They've got here's my TAM, and if I could just get 1%, and of the 95%, every single person says that.
I love that. Yeah, we get that in our business all the time. If I get 1%, okay, yeah. How are we going to get your first customer? Show me how you're going to get your first 10. Is the first question you should be asking yourself.
Exactly. Now, there's 2 things to that on the psychology bit. So I'll talk about the who gets investment first, and then I'll talk about the psychology of focusing on the TAM next, because understanding your market does have value. So the first bit is on the investment side. No one's investing in anyone for a large industry. I've not seen it. It's not happened. I'm sure it's probably happened somewhere. But of the 500 pitches I've seen, it hasn't happened once.
Explain that for everyone, for a large industry. Is it industry specific, niching? What does that mean to you?
So it's not about, and the one of the lead partners at Blackbird said this really well, and then was also parroting some things that were coming out of the US from a VC perspective. All industries are big. It doesn't matter.
Yep.
Anything that you put in front of me, all industries are big. And sure, if you can get 1%, if you can get 1% of that, great. What actually it comes down to is a couple things. So one is, do I think I can work with this person? Are you compatible? Not all investors are like for like. Some work well with others versus other groupings. So do I like you? Do I think I can coach you? Do I think that you're going to adapt? Do I think you've got the fire to actually make this happen? Do I believe in you? That is probably 50% of it, right? I've
Yeah,
seen
fascinating, isn't it?
it's a people business.
You mentioned adaptable quite a lot in this conversation. That's one of the pivotal things that is in your mind around what actually drives success. I'm just going to take that as a note for everyone listening. Adaptability, why is that so important in this space? If we mentioned it a number of times, but what is it about that person that can be adaptable? Because the business is driven by people. The business isn't adaptable. It's people in the business that are adaptable. How to become adaptable as people would be a fascinating exploration, because not everyone is.
I think, look, I can only pull from the experiences that I've seen.
Yeah.
And just being in the market, while right now I work with more multinationals and large scale-ups, even those groups have to be exceedingly adaptable to what they're doing. You can't stand still. So I think adaptability and the ability to change is just an operating the way that the world works right now.
We
And if you
need to have
do
that skill set, don't we? Yeah.
But on the opposite side, one of the, again, I won't give any names, but one of the examples of where we passed on investment was a group that had come in with a financial services aligned to the Big Four in Australia, which is a cash cow if you can tap into that, and was based on a regulatory piece. So it was basically, there was a certain regulation that was requiring something within the financial services arena. They had a piece of tech that you could attach on that would make these banks compliant. And whenever you use that kind of language, that typically means there's dollars somewhere in the environment. And the guy had a really great Rolodex. He had a great, network of people, and he was looking for funding. And we ultimately passed on that. Now, ultimately, the angel investors and VCs, what they're looking for is someone that they can make 10x, 1,000x percentage on, right? That's what they're looking for. They could have made that, but they passed. And the reason why they passed was because the man was perceived as being exceedingly arrogant and just difficult to work with. And so, and by virtue, not adaptable. And there's something to that, which is, and I've noticed this within the angel investment community, is I'm doing this because, yes, I want to see businesses succeed, and yes, I want money back, but I also want to enjoy my time, and I want to enjoy the people I'm working with. And so I would say don't underestimate the power of people just wanting to be happy and like the people that
Especially,
they work with.
I suppose, at that angel level, because you mentioned angels a few times, but that was at a VC level, I'm assuming. But even at that angel level, angels like to get involved and be around the people, and they like to back the person. VCs can be somewhat disconnected sometimes, depending on the VC you're working with, right? They might just look at the opportunity and throw it at the person. But yeah, it's still people. And you see, everyone that gets generally invested has a bit of flair about them. Not too arrogant, but can hold a conversation. Maybe got a bit of sales nous about them. They got something there that really draws people to them. Secondly, adaptability is critical. And then from my mind, I think that relentlessness is also important in the world of startup. If you're not relentless and you're going to get thrown a curveball and you don't know how to get up from it, or you're not willing to get up from it, then you're in all sorts of pain. Probably the harder one to find, I would say, when you're having a conversation with someone, unless they've got some serious experience behind them.
And where it's looking at the other areas where you end up getting funding on the relentless piece is how much activity did you get? If you're a tech company, how quickly can you get to 1 million subscribers? Where are you today? What did you accomplish over the last month? That's how they're looking at the relentless aspect of how much you're getting on and moving the needle. But some of the other areas they look at is, and it's almost on the opposite side of the spectrum, which is activity-based, make things happen. I've also seen investment go all the way towards, do you have a really novel idea? So one of the examples, the polar opposite of what we just talked about with the
It
million
is.
subscribers in the next 12 months. There was one company we invested in that basically was able to identify satellites that would soon be decommissioned and pull them out of space within 30 minutes and effectively get them back onto the ground, which is just crazy. I mean, if you want to talk about highly intelligent, kind of capable people, that's just
High tech. Yes.
yeah, that's otherworldly.
Yeah.
Complete opposite side of the spectrum, right? You can't show a million subscribers in a short period of time.
There's no million subscribers. No, there isn't. Yeah, but he's solving a critical problem that's happening up in our space right now with space junk flying around everywhere. Yeah.
It's a critical problem with about one or two buyers, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if I'm Optus and I put a satellite up into space, and this is where getting back to understanding your market is actually really important, not from a TAM perspective, but from an obtainable market perspective. And I'll talk about the difference in a second. But in that instance, I'm not going to show relentless hyper growth, but I've got this amazing idea, and capability with only one or two buyers. And knowing who those buyers are, how to communicate with them and engage with them is really critically important.
Oh, the whole business can change with one of them buying. That's the other thing, right? So, and then your path to exit might be just selling to those companies, or what does it look like? It's a very different proposition then. It's high risk, right? That's everything in startups high risk, but having one or two buyers, that scares me more than having the ability to impact multiple. But the advantage of having one or two buyers is we just got to relentlessly dig in and solve the problem for the one or two buyers, and eventually see if we can tick that to say, yes, let's go. So it's a different type of sale, isn't it? It's that whole enterprise. Could take years before we get commitment. That's the reality. We have to fund those years before we get commitment.
Yeah, exactly. But the last thing to round this out is I said, look, I'd handle this from who gets invested from don't do the TAM slide, whatever you do, please don't do the TAM slide. But the other thing is why, that's the one message, adaptability and please ditch the TAM slide. Those are the two things. But the other reason why total addressable doesn't really work is the psychology behind it. And what I mean by that is if you take the really easy example, which is the shoe market, right? You've got a specific type of athletic shoe. Your total addressable market might be $100 billion, but your obtainable market might only be 100 million. So by saying I get 1%, I get a million, it's not really compelling. But why you want to focus on your obtainable market is actually where the rubber meets the road. So it goes, okay, of my obtainable market, here are my class of buyers. Here are my customer types or segments, for lack of a better word. Here are the behavioral patterns of how these buyers and these industry dynamics influence what I do. Here are the geographies. Here are the digital and analog channels that I need to engage with. And so by not thinking TAM and thinking obtainable market, which is market research,
yes,
you start to adjust your own activity list of what you need to do and how you prioritize that. You begin to look at it differently because it's now, how do I execute to actually
well, that's going to enable you to execute, right? So if you've got a class of buyer and this person is XYZ in an organization, we can find those people on LinkedIn. We can start communicating with those people. We can build communication specifically to their problem set, not just 1% of the market. What does that mean, right? So it does, like you said, impact what you're doing on a day-to-day, because reality is we're trying to build a business here, not just trying to raise money too. I think people get lost in let's just raise capital. But in the end, we need to generate revenue to raise capital. It doesn't just one doesn't come without the other in most cases.
The raising capital item, and it'd be interesting on your view over your last, I think, 18 years or 22 years, forgive me, I forgot the number, but a long time. Some organizations need it, some don't. I've got an acquaintance that's an ex-MD out of Accenture. He started an AI consultancy, so basically AI readiness. How ready is a particular organization? And I think his first customer was actually Bunnings. May not be able to say that, but nonetheless, I have.
We don't know who he is. That's okay.
But basically, looking at the market or looking at the organization and going, okay, how ready are you to advance artificial intelligence and use ChatGPT across the organization and things like that? He didn't have a cent of funding. Doesn't make any sense for him to go after funding, and he's profitable profitable within this first 12 months of operating. Where you've got the example of the hoteling, the maid, the Betty technology that I talked about, their commercial model based on the dynamics of the industry, they can only charge on a per monthly basis. So they're looking at monthly recurring revenue, and they're only charging about $5 per month for revenue. For them to be profitable, they need high volume, but they're never going to get to the high volume unless they have capital. So I guess on the point that you just made, which is there's certain industry dynamics and dynamics of your company that are going to determine should you be going for that capital injection or can you bootstrap it? And that's a really important inflection point.
That's fair. If you are that low cost, high volume product, likely is you're going to need capital. You can probably paint that picture quite easily, unless you're self-funding from another revenue stream. Now, I've seen this in businesses that spin out products, and they've got a profitable business over here, and they've got a concept, and then they spun out a product as a result of it, and then they're impacting their industry because of it, and they're able to do it themselves. I've seen that occur. I've seen enterprise still require a bit of capital to get there for enterprise sales because you've got the long buying cycle. In his case, if he's a one-man, couple people show, you could actually bootstrap that quite easily. But if you need to build technology to support the outcome, then the problem lies. So if you needed to spend a couple of $1 million in tech and then go and funnel it out to Bunnings, in that case, then it's going to be difficult. So it's just really, I think, case by case, like you said.
Yeah.
Everyone's going to be in a different place. I think the consulting angle types of businesses, you can bootstrap because you can find revenue a lot easier in the world of consulting than you can in a technical product that you need to sell or get a lot of high demand or high volume customers onto.
Though what I'm seeing a lot lately, and you kind of just touched upon it, which is, and I've seen this on a few occasions, where you've got a consulting base and then you run into, well, hang on, I can actually fix this via technology, but the consulting base funds the development of that technology, and clients can at times fund the development of that technology, depending on the client.
I'll tell you a bit about us. We're a technology business. That's what we are. So we effectively have funded our own products across the journey. There's also built-in equity in other different businesses along the journey. But one of the interesting stories is a product we have in pharmacy. Very niche, very specific industry. We had an initial client in that space for probably at the beginning of our business life cycles, about 3 years when we started, 3 years in, where they needed a specific product to help with marketing in their business. 5 years later, they needed to evolve it. And I saw a bit of an opportunity. Okay, let's have a go. So I basically had a conversation and got the client to fund the build of the product from a seeding perspective. Did a bit of revenue share on a period of time. We owned the IP in the end. So they self-funded a product for us, and that's continuously driving revenue for the business. It's quite a fascinating. There's different dynamics and ways to build things because the customer just wants the outcome. They don't really care about the product stream. That was very niche. It's not a big, highly scalable business, but it's a profitable one. That depends what you're after, and sometimes you'll see those opportunities in consulting.
Yeah, and on that, one of the challenges is when you go in for a particular client and you've got a technology that you ultimately want to productize and sell back to market, is that client representative of the general market, or did you just cultivate a technology that's specific to the client?
Specific, yeah, you need to be conscious of that for sure. Yeah, because we have found that, and you had to customize for different clients because that client was different to the others, and it's true. There is that happens, but it's there are, like you said, in the way of consulting, you can bootstrap in different areas for sure.
But on that particular instance, I've had a few companies that have been lucky enough that they've been startups. So one of them now has got their Series A, but they started off as a consultancy and strategic workforce planning. They built an AI-enabled strategic workforce planning tool. You kind of intuitively, psychologically think, well, I'm a small business. I should be offering my services to small businesses. But actually, no, their product was complex. So they required more complex environments. And so their first client was the United Nations. And talk about
first client. That's a nice one for the Rolodex.
Exactly. And they actually got it through writing thought leadership. The UN basically did a Google search and they popped up and said, wow, you really know what you're talking about. And over the long haul, signed to this client. But the reason why I'm saying that is that what they were very conscious of is while that's awesome to land the UN as your first client, make sure that you're not creating a product that is solely for the UN.
The
And I think
UN,
that's one
yeah.
of the challenges, particularly being pre-Series A, of not getting
Yes.
too embedded in the client.
Makes sense because we can go after, and I've seen this in a fintech where we're around, where they would customize per client. This was worse, where they'd create new product streams because there was a new deal over here, a new deal over there. And I found that fascinating. And they sort of got a little bit lost and they had to really throw some stuff out to start churning a right course to serve a market. It became a little bit fragmented because they were reactive to the customer. We can do that. We're looking for revenue, but we still have to be a little bit dogmatic. But yeah, there's a bit of a balancing act in terms of how much you adapt to the customer. You probably have to adapt to the market more than the customer, I would say.
And you actually just reminded me. So there's three takeaways, right?
Yeah.
The importance of being adaptable. Don't do the TAM slide. And the third thing is what do you say no to? And that's something I find founders specifically struggle with, because there is this notion of I've got to be everything.
I have in the past.
Yeah,
We do,
I have to be
yeah.
everything to everyone. And I see it all the time. I'm going to go pitch to that, enterprise client, and you're like, well, your product doesn't align to that space. They're just interested in you to see what you're doing and what the market's doing, but you're running circles to get this done, and it's not going to eventuate to money. So I think the other key commercial outcome is the other key thing is don't be afraid to say no and be very clear on where you need to be putting your time. And it is okay to say no to something that's actually might be more advantageous for you than not.
Yeah, on that note, that's a great takeaway for the episode. Say no, be adaptive, throw out the TAM slide. Just quickly on a TAM slide, what should we be putting in instead? What would be the important part? Is it they're breaking it down to the buyers, the market, who they are? What is it? What's important there in terms of what you've seen?
A little bit of education of the market is important. Most investors, and not just investors, clients, grants, whoever it is that you're speaking to, they may not have an understanding of what you do and the problem you're solving. So a little bit of the problem statement and context is important, and maybe some numbers in of, it's $1 billion industry and this is how it breaks down. But other than that, I would move forward and focus on what you do. So whether that is you've gotten wins on the board and you're hustling quickly, you've got a product that is unlike any, it's like pulling satellites out of, from space down to Earth really reasonably quickly. Or you've got something, that you are emotionally invested in and will win, a particular or resolve a particular pain point. Focus on what you do and why it matters. That's the most important thing.
That's a priority. Dannielle, thank you for coming on DevReady Podcast. It's been fascinating, jumping left, right, and center. But in the end, we got to some strategies and some critical takeaways for people that are in the space of startup around adaptability. Throw the TAM slide away. I find that a really good one. And don't hone in on and say no. I think that was a good one right at the end in terms of, yes, you don't need to be everything to everyone, and you can't be. That's the reality of technology. There's going to be competitors across everything you're doing, and someone's going to do one tiny bit really well. Focus on what you're doing and do your bit well, and maybe use a collaboration and partnership along the journey, trying to do everything for everyone. So thank you for joining us today and coming on DevReady Podcast. It's been lots of fun.
Thank you, Andrew, for having me.